Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about race, ethnicity, immigration, and the association with these variables and the family. So, the basic theme that's going to be running throughout this is you have to know a little bit about how society is stratified into social classes. And so, your race, your ethnicity, your biological sex, gender, sexual orientation, and plus many other variables are associated with where you're located in the social class system because they're associated with whether or not you can rise up the social class ladder. For example, women historically were not able to participate. That's why they're known as the oppressed majority, because there's more women on the planet, yet they've never had a chance to really be able to achieve status by working, by becoming surgeons and doctors and lawyers and presidents, for example. Women have been oppressed for thousands and thousands of years. And so other ways by which people have been oppressed, have been subjugated into the lower classes, blocked their access to rise up the social class ladder to improve their life chances. Other variables include your religion, like if you were Catholic when it was Catholic versus Protestant, or Hindus versus Muslims. Hindus think Muslims are inferior. So therefore, the Pakistan came about because Muslims didn't want to be ruled by a Hindu majority. You have in the United States, you have racial conflict and racial subjugation of non-whites being subjugated into the lower classes. You had cultural imperialism upon the Native Americans. You had the subjugation of people from Latin America, from Eastern Europe. And the list just goes on and on and on. But the basis for all of that essentially is economics. So Europeans wanted to divide society into rich and poor, those who could have and those who could not. Women were already oppressed. They already had removed European males had already removed 50% of the competition by making sure women couldn't participate in politics and in business and things along those lines. So Europeans, as another way by which to remove competition and create a lower class workforces, came up with racial categories, okay? And this is a way of grouping people according to random traits, such as your country of origin or the color of your skin or other physical features. And so Europeans several hundred years ago, again, race is a brand new concept, several hundred years ago came up with racial categories. And it started out as Europeans and non-Europeans. Europeans, what do they have in common? Lighter colored skin. They became white. And then everybody else became non-white. And then non-white has been further subjugated into dozens of different racial categories depending on where you are on this planet. Like in Latin America, you have words like mulatto, mestizo. So if you're European mixed with Native American, mestizo. European mixed with African, mulatto. African Panamanian, mostly African. You have just a whole list of races you might never heard of. In America, your book breaks it out as you have white and black, and then you have different varieties of Asian and different varieties of Latin America, and Native American and Hawaiian. And again, all these categories themselves are made up. So I'm not going to go off on a huge rant about race. This is definitely something we would cover in a race and ethnicity class or diversity or intro to sociology. No one is actually white or black or Asian, okay? And at first, when you say that, it's really awkward. But once you start delving in the genetics of race, you realize that the Europeans who created racial categories to subjugate people in the lower classes, all Europeans becoming in the lower classes, they didn't understand genetics at the time. They didn't understand that their methods of grouping people together had no biological basis. And even Darwin knew this, 170, 180 years ago, was like, there's no biological basis for race. So a doctor cannot tell what race you are from your genetics. That's just not how it works. A white person in America has more genetically in common with someone from Africa than they do someone who's their white next door neighbor. Again, guys, hit the books a little bit, research this. But the idea, again, is that race was socially constructed so that we could divide society into hierarchically ranked social classes. The Europeans who could have European males, and then non-Europeans and females being subjugated into the lower classes. So to say race is socially constructed is that we're the ones who made up the categories. We're the ones who come up with the criteria. But again, race is supposed to be based upon biological differences, and it's not. So race itself is just a myth. Ethnicity on the next slide we're talking about is very real. It's about cultural, things in common. But race, no one is actually black and white. If you think you're different than a black person because you're white, you're wrong. It's just not the way genetics works, okay? Please just, check up on this, what the idea of race being a social construct, how race is socially constructed through, symbolic interaction. And it'll totally revolutionize your way of thinking. So again, from our perspective for this book, we're going to look at how race, is associated with the family. And so your race is associated with where you're located in the social class system, and therefore where you're located in the social class system can then affect the family, because those who are higher up in the social class system have higher life chances, more access, more opportunities than people in the lower classes, for example. So race and family, there's a major association there. But this is because whites, Europeans, did everything they could for hundreds of years to keep all non-whites in poverty. And so when you're looking at the association between race and the family, you're really looking at the association between poverty and the family, because really it's all about poverty, and race is just a subset of that, because historically non-whites were not allowed to get capital to rise up the social class ladder. So even though race is a social construct, the idea is the experience of race is incredibly real, though. Again, who gets the job, John or Daquan? And when you start to look at what racism looks like, that's what it looks like. A white-sounding name will get the job more than a black-sounding name, for example. And same thing goes for promotions. A man is going to get promoted 2 times over a woman. And then when you do the intersection between race and sex, you find that a white male, makes $1, and an Asian female makes 87 cents to a man's dollar. A white female makes 80 cents to a man's dollar. A black female makes 67 cents to a man's dollar. And a Latina female makes 60 cents to a man's dollar. And again, you start to see the association between racism and sexism, and how those are associated with how much money you make and how far up you can rise up the social class ladder. Okay, so the book does talk about how we're constantly redefining these races to include new groups of people. Again, words like Hispanic didn't exist pre-1960. There was no such thing as black and white before the 1700s. These, again, are just brand new ideas. And you might think of race as something permanent in society, like people have always been white and black, but that's absolutely not true. Race is a brand new idea that was constructed during the age of colonialism so that Europeans could take the upper class position and subjugate all non-Europeans into the lower classes. And race was just a very clear way of creating dividing lines between social classes. Ethnicity is about culture. Okay, race, the foundation of race is supposed to be biology, but when you look at your book, it's all about country of origin. It's absolutely ridiculous. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is defined as a group of people that share a common way of life, okay? And what's the definition of culture? A common way of life, okay? And then your book talks about racial ethnicity, of combining culture and race, and this is something you're also going to find, like how African-American culture, right? That's a blending of biological traits, like being African-American as a race, even though that's inaccurate. And also cultural factors like type of food and language and things along those lines. So when you are looking at how race is associated with the family and ethnicity is associated with the family, again, these have to be taken separately. Okay, so again, when you're looking at race, you're looking at, systems of privilege and power and oppression, and how that's associated with where you're located in the social class system. And then how race was associated with, slavery and things along those lines we'll get to in a second. And then ethnicity is all just more about culture, okay? It's examining the culture of the family and the socialization process of the family, and the adopting the values and ideologies of the family, and so that's a little bit more of a cultural perspective, an anthropological perspective, for example. But it's just very clear that you make sure that you understand that race is biology and ethnicity is culture, and so you have to take them separately and look at them as separate variables because they are associated with different things. Again, race for biology and phenotypes and genetics, which is why it's not like all black people share common genes. That's ridiculous. And then ethnicity is about common culture. Like, is there a common culture of black families? Is there an association because of segregation into races, into these segregated, culturally influenced families that can be a black family versus a white family versus an Asian family? And so again, when you start to look at the diversities of families and the associations between races and ethnicities and how those variables affect the family, just a lot of good data there. Okay, so the association between race and ethnicity and group interaction. So again, this is a powerful thing, and you have to look at hundreds of years of history. As I introduced earlier, Hindus think that Muslims are inferior. Therefore, when it comes to marriage and friends, are Hindus and Muslims actually becoming friends over in Asia, for example? And then in the United States, how is being Jewish associated with who you marry? If you're Jewish, do you marry somebody else who's Jewish, or do you open up your doors to be exogamous? And I'm never good with using these words, but to open up people to non-Jewish people, for example. And same things goes with you guys. And I like to ask my intro classes this question, but if you brought someone home of a different race, how would everyone in your family feel? Would they all be comfortable with it? Would they know there's a difference? Do you feel like you're different from that person because they have a different race? Okay? And again, race is not real, but it's part of people's identities, and it's part of society. And it's permeated every aspect of our lives. So to just say race isn't real doesn't really take away from the fact that it's part of us. And it is associated with who we marry. Is your race associated with your friends? Because of your race, were you exposed to different types of people from different places that could be of different races? Do you have a friend who's Indian and someone who's Asian and someone who's white and someone who's black and someone who's Latino and Native American? And are you intermixing with their people? And are they all options for you to marry and be friends with? Okay? Really cool stuff to think about. But endogamy, endogamy, again, I'm never good with the vocabulary. I'm sure you all are way smarter than me. But this is the idea of interacting within groups, where if you're endogamous, you just choose to interact with those people that you share a common culture with, a common race with. And exogamy is, again, do you go outside of those groups you belong to include all? Are you willing to, marry somebody of a different race? Are you attracted to people of different ethnicities? Great questions to ask. Because again, these are associated with who we marry. And the number one person that we do marry is usually 5 miles away from us. So where do you live? Is it somewhere that's diverse? Do you live out somewhere that is mostly one race? Are you even exposed to diversity? Again, is it rural, urban, suburban? How is region associated with who you marry? All of these factors have weight, okay? So, but what you're going to find is, depending upon the race and the culture and the social class that you identify with, they all tend to intermix in the reproduction of social classes and cultures. And this is some sad realities that we have to address. But again, if you're socialized into a lower class way of life, is there a difference between lower class culture and upper class culture? The language, the lingo, the knowledge, the values, the ideologies, the social norms. And so classes tend to be reproduced from generation to generation. And what you tend to find is, if you stick entire races and entire ethnicities into lower class culture, then you're also reproducing and keeping minority groups in lower classes and in poverty, which is then reproducing that culture. But you got to ask big questions like, if someone is socialized only into lower class culture, do they have the skills required, the knowledge required, the brain development required to go up to the higher classes? And this is a really tough thing when I teach psychology to talk about, but is there an association between brain development and your parents' socioeconomic status and the school you go to? And this is where you start to get into some of the dark sides, because, guys, yes. Okay, the number one factor associated with intelligence, for example, is, did you eat today? And so what about the kids that didn't have a chance to eat today? Not only are they not eating today, but they're probably not in a great school that's challenging them to work really hard to build new neural pathways for their neurons to run, to have a brain consisting of more efficient, highways of knowledge. And so that's the dark side, is that privilege based upon where you're located in the upper classes is associated with how well you do in school and the job you get and your wealth. And so again, when you start to look at the association between poverty and the family, guys, it's a lot more than just like, being in poverty is you're less likely to graduate college, you're more at risk for drugs and violence and abuse and all those other factors, but you're also more at risk for not fully developing and having a chance to become the full person that you want to be. So is it important for you to get out of your poverty to give your kids the best chance in life? And now you're starting to hit on some of the core concepts, because yes, the sad reality of it is yes, like the school you go to, the neighborhood you live in, your parents' socioeconomic status, the culture you're introduced to, your social network, your culture capital, all of these play a role in where you're located in the social class ladder, which is then located, associated with your life chances. So if you stick in entire races and whole ethnicities into the lower classes, what do you think is going to happen? And so again, this is why we need affirmative action, and we need to embrace inclusion and diversity, because you're keeping entire Einstein groups down. If you don't let women participate and minority participate, those are whole groups of people that don't have a chance to develop into the people that are going to make the world amazing. Think about it. How do you balance out poverty? Through education. How do you end poverty? Through education. So how do we get kids, living in these families to have good education so that they have the skills to be able to rise up the social class ladder? And so a lot of times we fail as a society at that. Hence this idea of class reproduction. If we as a society fail to teach everyone and socialize everyone in the lower classes to have the skills required to get above based upon merit. And we all know that it's not just about merit rising the social class, it's about your parents' socioeconomic status and other forms of power, etc. But what would happen if everyone had a chance? Okay? So again, we live in a society that was historically segregated into social classes and, then subdivided into racial and ethnic categories. And then did these people mix? And then how is that associated with, again, group behavior and group interaction? And again, all of this comes down to this idea of white privilege, in that Europeans, by dominating the, higher echelons of society, were able to have higher life chances. So they were able to get more education and more jobs and more wealth than other minority groups who were stuck in the lower classes, who never had a chance to get capital in their lives. And so again, now in America, since the civil rights movement, we've now opened our doors to women, rising up, and minority groups rising up. But prejudice and discrimination still exists. Again, it's the name. It's, do you have a white sounding name is often, that's where the implicit, kind of hiring managers playing a part. Are you going to get, denied for a mortgage because of your race? And that's the kind of stuff you see in the news constantly, because these are, again, the ways that whites keep people down. And again, it's a good question. It's like, do whites consciously keep people down? Or is it just, cultural reproduction from generation to generation that's more of an automatic response, an implicit, unconscious socialization process where you become that person? But again, in America, minority group suppression exists. Again, all of the variables you guys can think of: race, sex, gender, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these are factors, and whether or not you're subjugated into the lower classes. And that's then, of course, associated with your life chances and whether or not you can rise up the social class ladder. And again, how do you improve the well-being of families? We live in a capitalist society. You have to have the life chances, and the only way to get the life chances are to rise up the social class ladder. Okay? So really quickly, we're just going to go over some of the groups that have been subjugated. And again, I've given you a pretty good introduction. But again, Native Americans is questionable. Did the British and Spanish commit genocide when 95% of the population was decimated by guns, germs, and steel? That's a good question. But essentially, Europeans came over. They imposed their culture on Native Americans. They moved them to reservations where the land was not good. If you guys are interested in these subjects, let me know. I have tons of lectures on all of these groups for diversity and race and ethnicity classes. I can send them over. But again, the history of the interaction with whites is not pretty. Broken treaties, removal to specific lands, and then the government interventions have completely failed. And so Native Americans have incredibly high rates of all the risk factors, for poverty and things along those lines, because of the subjugation. And so the idea of cultural imperialism is this thing that, Europeans came over and we tried to impose a European way of life on Native Americans, which meant their family itself was affected by that. So we took apart an entire family system, okay, that had been working for thousands of years, okay? And we just, imposed a white family structure on Native Americans, a white economic structure on Native Americans. And, that's just something we're not going to, that you guys should be thinking about, how does that go? And then how did the Native American families respond to cultural imperialism? And were they able to hold on to that culture that they once had, a traditional family that's more egalitarian, that embraces cooperation over competition, that accepted same-sex marriage and polygamy, respected their elders, everyone playing a role in the socializing of the children? How much of a Native American family life was just destroyed through cultural imperialism, and how much of it has been able to be maintained is something that is definitely worthy of looking into as a side project. African Americans, same thing. When African Americans came here as slaves, they were stripped from their families, they were stripped from their ties, their names were removed, they were given white-sounding names, they weren't allowed to have their customs were stripped from them. African culture was completely removed from their lives. What tidbits remain, you can definitely see, like in Louisiana and Creole culture, for example. And then since the ending of slavery, through Jim Crow and other methods of segregation and oppression, African Americans were completely restricted into the lower classes. They were stuck in poverty. And again, the effect on poverty, it's not race that's associated with the deconstruction of having like two-parent households, for example, which is what your book talks about, the African Americans. It's poverty. So what is the effect of poverty on the family structure? And that's why you start to get into, why our black families have the highest rates of single-parent households. Well, I mean, just think about it. How does the American racist system suppress black males and black females from being able to get access to good jobs, to provide for their families and things along those lines? So some of these traditional family structures that you might see, might not work with African Americans due to racism and the effects of prejudice and discrimination. So the book definitely talks about this idea of a weak tradition of nuclear families. But again, you have to realize, as I stated here, it's due to economics, not being allowed to get jobs. It's not due to the psychology of, an African American man. However, how does racism and prejudice and discrimination, how does that affect the psychology of an African American man and African American women? That's the kind of things you should be thinking about. And then how does that then associate it with the family? Because if you're beaten down through racism and you don't believe you can get ahead, do you even believe you can provide for a family? And so again, very interesting things. If you guys are interested in the psychology of racism, that's a good area to look into. But again, I won't bore you guys with that today, even though it's not boring. I didn't mean to say it like that. What I meant to say is I could talk for hours and hours on that subject, but we're already pretty deep into this lecture. So you definitely can look at the association between urban poverty in the north and indentured servitude in the south, because again, African Americans migrated to the cities in the north, and then after Reconstruction failed, most Southern African Americans had no choice but to go back and work for the plantation owners once again, not as slaves but as indentured servants to the land. Okay. You tend to have this matriarchal family structure as a higher percentage of African Americans, but again, a lot of that has to do with the effects of racism upon black males. The rise of the black middle class is growing, and again, that comes from civil rights and how society itself is becoming less prejudiced and discriminatory. And so, again, we're much more favorable to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And, it's definitely stressed nowadays that overt racism is unacceptable. So Latinos are the largest minority group in the U.S. Latinos will surpass whites here in the next several decades. You have an incredible cultural diversity when you're talking about Latino culture. So again, when you look at Latinos, That's defined as ancestry in Latin America, and then the Caribbean is generally included in this. But you have people that were already there, the people that were already living there, the Native Americans. You had Africans that were brought over as slaves to the islands and to the mainland. You had Europeans coming over. Everybody was mixing. In Latin America, it's about how white are you, light-skinned are you. They have something called the color gradient. They don't even have racial categories. They have a color gradient to account for a social class location. Much of Latin America was consolidated by the United States after the Mexican-American War, for example, and then through the American colonization of islands. But when you're talking about Latino culture and then Latino families, you have to really think about, the origin, the country that they're living, the history of that country, the blending of different cultures, and how has that influenced the family structure. But what you find again with Latino families is you have very strong attitudes toward familism, which is just this idea of the family bonds are more important probably than anything else in life, and that's not something that's shared. That's shared universally, the importance of family bonds. But some cultures are more individualistic, like the United States, compared to like a communal culture like Latin America or parts of Asia, for example. You do have flexing migration patterns depending upon the attitudes toward Latin Americans in the United States at any given time. Sometimes we've had positive attitudes and opened the doors. Other times we've tried to put up border walls. And again, this attitude shift is constantly in flux in the United States depending upon political factors. Again, but Latinos as a minority group are also subjugated to all the woes of race and ethnicity in America, which is again the subjugation of people into the lower classes. So therefore you see lower educational attainment rates, lower job prestige, lower wealth, not because of the people themselves, but again, due to prejudice and discrimination keeping people down. Asian Americans, as we talked about a couple lectures ago, the idea of Asian Americans coming over, because they had to leave their families and come here, you saw the splitting of families, which had a great effect on Asian American families. Again, with Latin Americans, same thing. We have, times of indifference and times of extreme prejudice toward Asian Americans. So that has affected immigration patterns. But when you're looking at Asian American families, again, very communal families. You see a lot of multi-generational families, different people from different generations living together. You have diverse ideologies depending upon the country that you're from, which then influences your attitudes toward, what's important in life. Asian Americans historically stress education, have stricter parenting styles, again, place less value on independence and more on communal attitudes, thinking about others. Definitely have the respect and care for elders, which you kind of have to question when it comes to white Americans. How do white Americans treat the elderly is a really good question for gerontology, if you guys are interested in that. Asian Americans tend to have higher socioeconomic status. But that definitely is more so for the Chinese and Japanese than it is for like the islanders. If you look into it a little bit more specifically, you're going to find that. Because again, Asia's humongous. So you're talking about like half the world here, okay? So there's just so many countries and so many cultures, and it's incredibly diverse. And every one of them is anthropologically associated with, different traditions and the food and the things that families do and all of that. So again, if you guys are really interested in all of that, check out like the anthropology of the family, where you really go deep into, each culture. And sociology, we're looking at systems and structures and how that's associated, like how race is a structure of society that is an institution, okay, and it exists for a purpose, which is to subjugate people into groups, and so that's sociology. But if you guys are definitely interested in like delving into Asian cultures and Latin American cultures and Latin American families, anthropology has some really great classes for that. Just to go over some of the things in your book when it comes to immigration. Chinese Exclusion Act, that excluded Chinese, which then get extended to everybody in Asia. So Asians were pretty much not allowed to come to America between the 1880s and the 1930s, and furthermore, Americans just completely took their citizenship away. If you were Chinese and living in America in like the 1850s, too bad, you're no longer American. They took it away. Congress later apologized for that. That was pretty awful. Immigration Act of 1924, when we became prejudiced toward Eastern Europeans. You had the Bracero program of the 40s to the 60s, where we brought Latin Americans in as indentured servants, essentially, fruit picking, farm work, things along those lines, because they needed a lower class workforce. Since the 1965, we've had a much more positive attitudes toward immigration than we had in the past. So you had some amendments to the Immigration Act and Nationality Act that increased the amount of Asians and Latinos coming in. And as a result, 15% of the U.S. currently are immigrants, which is a really high number. And I was actually really impressed with that because I thought it was less. But 15% of the U.S. are immigrants. I was like, all right, that's probably we got some immigrants. Good. This is America. We need immigrants. I mean, it's like that's where people come, right? So Homeland Security Act of 2002 reduced Latino immigration. And again, this kind of comes down to the building of the border wall to stop terrorists from coming in because they decided terrorists were going to come into the United States from Mexico. But again, remember that terrorists are more likely to be white, criminals are more likely to be white, but yet the police pull over blacks and Latinos 8 times to every one white person, even though a white person is twice as likely to have drugs and a gun in a car than any other race. So again, people's arguments against immigration, and immigration increases the gross domestic product of a country. So again, immigration, bringing people in, we could help families, we could, help American families too, because the people that are here actually become managers of the immigrants, and then this whole system starts again. It's a side project. If you guys are interested, check out the association between immigration and economics. Does it improve the gross domestic product? And then look at how immigration improves families because they can come to a place that has higher socioeconomic status and make a life for themselves. Okay. Deferred action for childhood arrivals of 2012. This is when Obama started opening up the doors to letting people in and letting people stay here, but just not getting a permanent status because that is a much more thorough process. And then child separation of 2018 when the government took that back and we just ended up taking the kids and then stripping them from their parents. Undocumented immigration is, about 5% of the United States. And so is there a way to deal with undocumented immigration to improve families in America? Your book breaks down culture as acculturation and assimilation. So when you're talking about the families coming over as immigrants, and then, other races being absorbed into, the culture of America, for example, like when did the Irish become white? The English think they're an inferior race historically. So your book talks about acculturation, which is, the absorbing of American culture, and then assimilation, becoming more like American culture. Interracial marriage, just on an up note. Okay, so again, that we kind of talked about this earlier about how would your family feel, and but what you're starting to see is interracial marriage is going through the roof, which is just a really positive sign that racial intolerance is going down, ethnic intolerance is going down. Historically, it was completely taboo. Like if a white and a black person were to get married, they'd probably be killed. That's just the way it was, okay? But since 1980, it's increased 20 times to like 10 million interracial marriages from 400,000 in 1980, which is just like an incredible uptick when you think about it. So just to end this a little bit out of a positive note, people are getting better. These segregated cultures, these segregated families, that's deconstructing. The nuclear family in general is deconstructing. You're starting to see diverse family types and, a lot of blending. But again, at the core of all of this is economics because, how do we keep it so families, no matter what type of family you are, same-sex family, heterosexual family, single-parent family, how do we help it so you can live in a neighborhood that has a good school for your kids so they can fully develop, And so again, you start to look at how race is associated with social class, location, ethnicity, prejudice against people that are, how does that associated with where you're located in the social class ladder? So really good stuff to think about. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.